I would like to start my opening in the same way that the Right Honourable Gentleman did, in underlining this House's complete condemnation of the appalling terrorist attacks that took place in Sri Lanka and also in Northern Ireland. The timing at Easter, with people at prayer, murdered at prayer, I think is just utterly shocking, and why it has raised, I think, rightly, the utter condemnation from right across this House, and how our thoughts very firmly are with the Sri Lankan community within the United Kingdom, and our prayers, our condolences, knowing that there will have been loved ones that will have been lost by so many people. Equally, at this time, and as a former Northern Ireland Secretary, the brutal murder of Lyra McKee is utterly shocking, disgusting, and our thoughts and love and prayers are very firmly with her loved ones, her family, all who cared for her. What an incredible individual she was. And at this time, as her funeral is currently underway, I know this House equally would wish to send its thoughts, prayers and condolences to all who love her and all who care for her. Madam Deputy Speaker, to come to the debate at hand this afternoon, our local authorities and the people who serve them are delivering essential services and changing lives, and it is right we support them to succeed. And I pay tribute to all who work with our local councils up and down the country for the work that they do and the difference that they make in the lives of so many, and I pay tribute to them. As Secretary of State, I have been very clear in my support for local government, in seeing the benefit that local councils are able to deliver for the people that they serve, and how I commend them, I support them, and how I look forward to finding new ways in which we can see services equally delivered in that sense of devolution and that sense of how services are most effectively delivered closer to where they are provided. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I say gently to the Secretary of State that in Harrow, what he has just said will feel like weasel words in the context of a 97% reduction in revenue support grants. Can he offer any assurance that he has persuaded the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the coming comprehensive spending review to invest in local government and social care?
Well, I would point out to the Honourable Gentleman that this year we have given our local authorities access to £46.4 billion, a cash increase of 2.8% and a real terms increase in funding. And the settlement includes extra funding for local services with a strong focus on supporting some of our most vulnerable groups. And it is part of a four-year settlement accepted by 97% of local authorities that gives so many of our areas access to substantially more funding than the least. Average spending power per dwelling for the 10% most deprived authorities is around 22% more than for the least deprived 10% in 2019-20. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. And does he agree with me that as part of the process of increasing the amount of funding that is available, we should be increasing the practice of business rates retention as a way of incentivising local innovation and enterprise? In places like Cheltenham, it provides an incentive to build out our cyber park, which will create a pipeline of local businesses providing that income which can then be spent on vital public services.
Well, I think my honourable friend has made the point very effectively of the innovation that we see within local government, within local authorities, and indeed the work that he has rightly underlined for his own community, and how local authorities have campaigned for more flexibility and control over the money they raise, including the ability to see a more self-sufficient sector funded from own resources, and this includes the move to 75% business rate retention, and therefore I think the benefit that that brings with it. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend. I wondered if he would consider introducing changes to the funding system to reward efficiency, because as he knows, councils such as Bromley, near to his own in Bexley, are historically low-cost authorities who have achieved enormous efficiencies over the years and yet are asked again and again to make further efficiencies. Would he not agree with me that it is time to adjust their baselines in order to reflect the historic efficiencies that they've achieved?
I say to my right honourable friend that obviously I know that Bromley does do some incredible work for their local community. The innovation, the efficiencies, the real quality that I know that they have at the heart of their efforts. And I think he equally raises the ongoing issue that we have in relation to our fair funding review, the review of relative needs and resources. And certainly, as we reflect on the submissions that we've received to date in respect of how that balance is struck in terms of how funding is applied, we will obviously be giving very careful consideration to a range of factors in order to ensure that we are seeing that those funds are applied in the appropriate way to recognise the relative needs and resources of individual authorities. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Grateful to the Secretary of State, but will he not recognise that in the case of Birmingham, cumulative cuts of £775 million, which will have been the figure after a 12-year period, is simply not sustainable for a city that has 42% of its children growing up in poverty? And whether or not he accepts that, will he at least do something about historic underfunding? Because he will know that the formula for Birmingham was changed to recognise historic underfunding in 2016-17, but as a result of not backdating that to correct underfunding in the previous 2 years, Birmingham has been shortchanged by £100 million. Will he at least put that right?
I would gently say to the honourable gentleman that Birmingham is one of the highest per capita funded authorities, but equally I know the representations that he and other MPs have made to me from Birmingham, and I'm looking at those representations carefully. What clearly is not helped is the ongoing strike action that's taking place in Birmingham with the non-collection of rubbish, the impact that's having on communities, and therefore I would certainly urge him to support the Council in actually dealing with some of the real challenges, the industrial strife that is very firmly being seen in Birmingham with all of the manifestations that that is creating. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Now, Hull City Council have seen a reduction in 37.8% of their funding since 2010, and this is having an impact on children with special needs and disabilities. Now, historically, there has been no account taken of the number of children with SEND in an area and the amount of funding that they receive for their high needs block. If the government are serious about looking at a review into the way that local authorities are funded, surely this should be something that they start to take into account.
I say to the Honourable Lady that I am working closely with the Education Secretary as we look towards the next spending review. Obviously, knowing that, as I'll come on to the support that is being provided, for example, in relation to adults and children's social care, as well as some of those other pressures as well, that we are investing further on a number of those fronts, and therefore how we are recognising and have reflected on a number of the pressures that we have seen. And clearly, as we look at the further review on relative needs and resources, and as we look towards the next spending review, obviously I will be looking at the data and the evidence very closely and very carefully. I'll give way one last time and then I'll make some progress.
I'm grateful to him. One of the things that's missing from this debate so far is that in terms of social care, the vast majority of domestic visits are actually carried out by employees of private sector companies as opposed to employees of local authorities. Most of these services have been outsourced. We're seeing huge numbers of these companies going bust. It surely shows the Minister that the system's unsustainable when there's 100 care homes gone bust in the last couple of years.
Well, the Minister for Social Care on the bench has said to me that the number of providers is going up, but I can assure him, with the steps that we take in conjunction with the Department of Health and Social Care, the assurances, obviously the quality work that colleagues across government support and strengthen, and equally the arrangements that we do put in place where there are failures within the market, where we need to put arrangements in place to step in should there be a failure of supply in relation to a particular provider, and how I think that when we look at a number of examples that have taken place, the work that has gone in to make sure that that is done effectively. But it is about the quality of service, and therefore, as we look on the broader issues of social care, which I know many across the House have rightly touched on, that focus on the delivery of care, the delivery of those outcomes, and how simply spending money is not simply the answer in terms of the delivery of the high-quality care and those outcomes that some of the most vulnerable need in our society. I give way to my honourable friend, and
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's right to talk about the quality of care, and does he recognise that Bromley, his next-door neighbour, is an example of a willingness to participate in close joint working with the health sector and with social services. Given that one of the greatest pressures is that of the growing cost on top-tier authorities of caring for the elderly, will he make sure that new funding review and new arrangements particularly enthuse and support those authorities who are prepared to do joint working as local authorities like Bromley are?
Well, it's interesting because the right honourable gentleman was trying to highlight that there was not good joined-up working, where I think my honourable friend has rightly highlighted some of the good practice that is there, that further integration between health and social care, indeed how the funding, £240 million of funding that has been committed through this year's settlement, was very firmly indeed aimed at ensuring that there were those pressures that were taken off the NHS. And actually, I do pay great tribute to the work that local authorities up and down the country have been engaged in demonstrating that very clearly, particularly around things like delayed transfers of care, where we've seen a 45% reduction since the high point fairly recently, and therefore how that is demonstrating how we make that difference. I will give away one very last time, and I will make some more progress.
So on that point about delayed discharge of care, we recognise that ultimately there needs to be more integration between health and social care and more money, but doesn't the point that he made really have a lot of impact? Because where we have put money into social care and we've seen good structural working between local authorities and the health service, we've actually seen a radical reduction in delayed discharge of care. So it's not all about money, it's about innovative joint working.
I totally agree with what my honourable friend has rightly said, and therefore that joint working that I think has been reflected on issues such as delayed discharges of care, and therefore how it is about ensuring that there is that good practice, how we are sharing that more broadly, something that equally we are doing in relation to children's social care as well, and funding that the Department for Education is giving to ensure that that is better adopted as well, because it is about good practice, it is about looking at those outcomes, and therefore the simple binary approach that the opposition are seeking to take, I think, is mistaken. The other issue that the right honourable gentleman was very fulsome about was in respect of council tax. Now, I do want to just remind the party opposite that in government, they were the ones that made ordinary families pay the price for their failures, with bandy council tax more than doubling under Labour, with families paying an extra £750. And even now, Labour want to abolish the council tax referendum limit, which prevents against excessive rises in council tax. So it's all very well the right honourable gentleman sort of trying to suggest that he was on the side of ordinary hard-working families. That's not what we see from Labour in government. That is not what we are seeing now. And that the real price of Labour is that it always costs you more. And it's not just the cost of a Labour government, it's also what people are paying now. Households in Labour-controlled areas have to pay higher council tax to make up for incompetent collection as well. In the worst hit areas, Labour councils have unpaid council tax bills of up to £100 million, which is equivalent of £439 for every household. The 10 councils with the worst collection rates in England are all Labour run. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Secretary of State for giving way. It's true that Labour are promising £500 billion of extra spending, but what they are not telling ordinary hard-working families is that will mean a double increase in income tax, a doubling of national insurance, a doubling of council tax, a doubling of VAT. Not my words, but the words of a former Labour Shadow Chancellor.
Well, I think the interesting thing from some of the exchanges that we had earlier on was, I think that acknowledgement that even back in 2010 that the last Labour government, in going into the 2010 election, didn't guarantee to protect local government. And that actually it has been some of the difficult choices, some of the issues that we have had to confront to put the public finances back on an even keel. And I know that has not been easy, and I pay tribute to the innovation that councils have been engaged in up and down the country to help us put this right. And I think it is telling that there has been no acknowledgement of that in the context of the comments that the Right Honourable Gentleman made in his opening remarks. I will give way to the Honourable Lady first. No, thank you.
I thank the Minister for giving way. It's very interesting listening. He's saying that the Tory government wants to spend on what works. Well, if we're going to spend on what works is the Troubled Families programme, which is due to end next year. Yeah. Will the Minister take this opportunity to commit to the House that he will do everything he can to keep that programme running after 2020?
I'm glad that the Honourable Lady has mentioned the Troubled Families programme, because it's something I will be coming on to in greater detail in my speech, because I have been hugely impressed by the outcomes, as she rightly points out, making that difference in people's lives, and how I believe very strongly the Troubled Families programme now has shown that evidence base as to how it is profoundly doing that, and actually doing again what has been described, I think rightly, across the House, on being able to pull different services together to have that person-centric approach, and actually breaking down some of the silos, breaking down some of those barriers, and why I am a huge champion of the Troubled Families programme. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
State for giving way to me. So far, the Secretary of State has blamed striking workers. He has blamed councils up and down the country. The one group who are not being blamed is his rotten government, and this responsibility lies firmly at his door. When will the Secretary of State stop blaming everybody else and take some responsibility for the crisis that we see in this country?
Well, I say to the Honourable Lady that she must equally reflect on the fact that the Labour opposition voted against a real terms increase in the core spending available to local authorities this year, which included the additional funding on health and on adults and children's social care, which of course is why we listened to, why we recognised the pressures that were there and made those, I think, rightful judgments that we did in respect of those pressures that councils explained to us. So the opposition may wax lyrical about funding pressures when their own councils aren't even helping themselves. And I'll say this, Madam Speaker, the opposition, I think, do have some front to claim to be, I will in a second, to be the champions of local government and localism. Because I did take the time to read the Shadow Secretary of State's recent speech to Labour's local government conference this year. And there were some big and bold claims. It's just a shame they weren't backed up by the reality. The Right Honourable Gentleman opposite said they were the party of devolution. Well, I must congratulate him on his selective memory, because if I remember correctly, it was his party that after 13 years left the UK one of the most centralised countries in Europe. and how it took Conservatives in government to roll the era of centrally imposed targets and tick-box culture back, imposed by the party opposite, and it's this government which has put the public finances back on track and cleared up the mess we inherited from Labour. I give way to honourable gentleman. I give way again. I give way to honourable gentleman.
Well, I'm very grateful to him for giving way, but I'm sure he wouldn't want people watching this debate to be misled by what he's just said about police funding. He knows, as well as we all do, that the reason that Labour voted against the spending plans for the police was because we were proposing far greater spending on our police, and that is why members of the Labour Party voted against what we saw as a derisory offer from him to the police services that are desperately under-resourced.
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that there was significant investment that we have given to the police, and indeed, as the Chancellor has equally further committed on some of the most acute pressures that we know are being experienced, and why, and again, I was more talking about the local government settlement rather than the police settlement, which obviously was dealt with separately. But equally, it was that commitment to additional resources that we recognise, and how we are backing the police to deal with the issues of crime. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm glad that my right honourable friend has been reminding the Labour Party of their past record, that somebody had to come in and help pick up the pieces in 2010. Might he like to remind them that it was they who introduced compulsory capping on council tax levels, reducing the discretion which local authorities had, abolished by the Conservative-led coalition. So they just introduced central planning through the directly imposed regional spatial strategies, overriding the wishes of local communities. It's they who enforced compulsory unitary councils in those areas which did not want them, one of those reversed by a Conservative government, in favour of the bottom-up approach brought in by this government. For them to pose as a party of devolution has got more front than Harrods, as my old grandma used to say.
Well, my honourable friend makes his point in his inimitable style and way, but it is that sense of how we have promoted that greater sense of devolution. It comes back to my point in trusting communities, trusting councils, trusting people at the sort of grassroots to be able to get on and deliver for their communities. And it is this government which has given local authorities the tools and the resources that they need to do their vital work, and it's Conservative councils which are providing value for money, delivering quality services for their residents, whilst keeping council tax lower than Labour and lower than the Liberal Democrat councils. And yes, this includes doing things like the right thing on recycling, with Conservative councils recycling, reusing or composting around 49% of their waste, as compared to 36% in Labour councils. And it is about that local delivery, which is what so much of, I know, the current campaign and the forthcoming votes at the local council elections will be about so much. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
To the Secretary of State giving way. One area where the Secretary of State has failed, this government has failed since 2010 to invest, is in its staff. It may offer warm words, but a 21% real terms pay increase for some of the worst paid workers is completely unacceptable. How is the Secretary of State going to address that issue?
Well, I hope the Honourable Lady will have noticed that on the last numbers, actually the real wages are actually now going up. But I do remind her again of the fact that pay restraint across the public sector was as a consequence of the mess that we inherited under the last Labour government. And I know that this has been difficult. This has been really tough. This has been incredibly hard. But equally why we are determined to maintain the strong economic path for our economy, to see that we are ensuring that our public finances are now back in the right space and are not left in the fashion that the last Labour government did indeed leave them within. But I am mindful of the essential role our local authorities play in helping the most vulnerable in our society. And I do recognise the growth in demand in adults and children's social care and the pressure that this brings. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. I'm just interested in the exchange backwards and forwards across the Chamber about which side's been best at devolution, or perhaps you could say which has been the worst at devolution in terms of funding of local councils. It was in fact the Thatcher government that brought capping in to rates and then was continued into council tax and took away the freedom from local councils to set their own business rates. Yeah. Isn't the reality that neither the last Labour government nor the coalition, though this government, has done anything fundamentally to increase the freedoms of councils to raise their own funding at local level? Yeah. I hope he's going to address this. I hope he's going to address this when we finally see his devolution framework.
I look forward to engaging with the honourable gentleman and his committee in relation to this on, yes, these issues of devolution, yes, in relation to issues around devolution of business rates and so many other things too, because I do believe so profoundly in the real merit, the real benefit of seeing those decisions being taken more locally and that sustainable position for local government. But I will make progress, Madam Deputy Speaker, because I'm conscious of the number of other members that do wish to participate in this debate. But coming back to the issue of social care, it's why out of the more than £1 billion of extra funding committed to councils at last year's budget, £650 million will be going towards adult and children's social care in 2019-20. Of this, £240 million has been allocated to ease pressures on the NHS, on top of the £240 million announced in October to address the then winter pressures. The remaining £410 million can be spent on either adults or children's social care and, where necessary, to take the pressure off the NHS, meeting requests from local authorities for greater flexibility. And taken with the adult social care precept and the improved Better Care Fund, this means the government will have given councils access to £10 billion in dedicated funding, which can be used for adult social care in the 3-year period from 2017-18 to 2019-20. And when it comes to protecting our children, we're investing £84 million over the next 5 years to expand 3 of our most successful children's social care innovation programme projects. The projects will keep more children at home safely in up to 20 local authorities. But in the long run, it is our work to ensure our health and care systems are better integrated that will be our most powerful tool in ensuring we have a sustainable approach in the years to come. But I want to come back to the issue of troubled families, which the Honourable Lady rightly highlighted, and how I believe that our programme is helping local authorities support families with complex needs and improve outcomes for individuals. It has been a clear catalyst for local services, transforming how they work together, making them more integrated and cost-efficient, reducing dependency and demand for expensive services. The results speak for themselves. The latest national programme evaluation shows that when compared to a similar comparison group, targeted intervention saw the number of children going into care down by 1/3, the number of adults going to prison down by 1/4, and juveniles in custody down by 1/3, and 10% fewer people claiming job seekers allowance. And while I do recognise that there is more to do, it is a real tribute to the tireless efforts of family workers, local authorities and their many partners in our public services and the voluntary sector, because it's about so much more than the financial boost you get from a regular wage. It is also about the pride and the dignity that comes from being able to take control of your own life. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the future of this country is not an ever-growing collection of handouts and entitlements, but of growing prosperity and independence, and that equally applies to local government. This government is working to build a more confident, self-sufficient and reinvigorated local government. And with the end of the current multi-year deal in sight, it's clear we need to take a longer view on how we fund councils as we do move to a stronger, sustainable and smarter system of local government. Preparations this year for increased business rate retention, a new approach to distributing funding between local authorities and the upcoming spending review will be pivotal to this, as will important work that's underway with authorities and the wider sector to better understand service costs and pressures. For years, councils have asked us for more control over the money raised, and we're giving it to them through our plans to increase business rate retention to 75%, and in the process providing local authorities with powerful incentives to grow their authorities. And authorities estimate they will retain around £2.5 billion in business rate growth in 1920 under the current system, a significant revenue stream on top of the core settlement funding. But as well as more control, councils want and need to see a clearer link between the allocation of resources and local circumstances, and our new fairer funding formula will ensure a more transparent link between local need and resources and the funding councils get. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the leadership and creativity of our councils, delivering high-quality services for their residents as well as efficiencies for the taxpayer. We are determined to give them the freedoms and flexibilities they need so that our local government can continue to flourish and deliver vital services to meet the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And yes, as voters go to the polls at the local elections, it's this Conservative government which is providing a real terms increase in spending power for local government. It's this Conservative government which is giving councils the freedoms to deliver for their local communities, and it's hard-working Conservative councillors which are providing value for money for hard-working families and the quality services that their residents within those council areas deserve.
Before I call the SNP front bench, just to advise colleagues that we have about 25 speakers, so if everybody could stick to around 10 minutes, that should be fine, and we won't need to impose a time limit. Dr. Philippa Whitford. Keeley.
There wasn't a chance to correct the Secretary of State, but I think it is important to do so. My honourable friend, the member